Thank you. At this time, I'm going to invite Amber forward, and we are going to spend some time in a dialogue for us as we learn more about Amber's story and her experiences with the church. Oh, I was going to steal your... See, Haley, I was going to mess it up from the beginning.
I was instructed to sit on the side.
I know, we had strict instructions. First of all, thank you so much for being here this morning. I was introduced to Amber through I think it was through the Refuge, which Kathy Escobar is the CEO, or I'm not founder, and she was doing a Zoom, I think, with you, and I just happened to see it and jumped on and got to hear a little bit of Amber's story, and I know some of you have read her first book. Some of you out there have read her first book. And then a dear friend of mine we share in common as well. So we're so glad to have you to come and share your story today. And I'd invite you to just start by telling our congregation a little bit more about your upbringing, a little bit more about your story, so that you can get us to where we are here right now.
Sure. Well, good morning. It's an honor to be here with you this morning. I come from Colorado Springs. I'm almost a Colorado native. I was actually born in Montana and moved to Colorado by way of Focus on the Family, which is where my dad started working when I was 3 years old. So he started working there actually when they were still based in California. Oh, wow. So way back in the day. And then when they transplanted to Colorado Springs in '91, my family moved with them. So very much grew up in kind of this epicenter of evangelicalism, and where many, not just Focus on the Family, but many other conservative evangelical ministries are based. And so my world was very small. It was very white. It was very conservative. Everybody looked and believed exactly like we did. There wasn't room for diversity in my upbringing and in my world. And I was homeschooled all the way because that was part of the culture. That was part of what you did to raise your children in this faith, is to kind of guide them through and kind of tailor what they learned to kind of fit the mold of evangelicalism, which then kept my world very small. And then you add to that purity culture, which was really coming to its height when I was a teenager. And that very much impacted the way that I viewed myself, the way I viewed sexuality, the way I viewed love, and again, kept me from exploring any of that. Because it taught you to save sex for marriage. It taught you that marriage was only between a man and a woman. It even went so far as to teach you that you should court instead of date. The whole I Kiss Dating Goodbye that was made famous by Joshua Harris, and this idea that to some degree you wouldn't even hold hands or kiss until your wedding day. So very much keeping who you are a mystery even to yourself, because there was no room to explore who you are, what you needed in a partner, what love looked like to you. And so it just kept everything in this kind of tight and needy little box, right? And that very much impacted me, not knowing, of course, that I was gay, not having any exposure to people of different identities or even faith systems or disabilities or people of color. Like, none of that was in my world. It was just so very, very small. And so you can imagine then what that looks like as you grow up in this world where everybody looks and believes exactly like you do, and then to find out that you really don't fit that mold, but not even having anywhere safe to talk about that, because there was no one in my world. Everyone was the same. So there's nowhere to even take those questions in a safe space without being sent to conversion therapy or exorcism or things that were very extreme that do a lot of harm. And so those kind of things were very present in my world. And my father, playing the role that he did, he is the executive producer of Adventures in Odyssey at Focus on the Family, and has been for over 30 years. So if you're familiar with Focus and their values, which I see a lot of heads nodding, you know, like that Adventures in Odyssey is a huge part of Focus and a huge part of what they produce and what they do. And so my family was kind of seen as this pedestal family that other people looked up to. So there wasn't a lot of room for error. You were expected to always be on your best behavior. You were expected to be the role model. You were expected to be the example and to kind of always have everything together. And that's a lot of pressure to put on any kid, but especially one that is tended to perfectionism. And then you add other components like that of being gay. And so that put a lot of pressure on me, especially when I entered my teen years. Because as a child, I don't know that I noticed it quite as much. But as Focus got bigger, as Odyssey got bigger, it continued to put more and more pressure on me. And so my parents were kind of seen as these leaders within the evangelical community. And when I got to the place where I was starting to learn for myself, although even that's delayed because of how small my world was, and a lot of what we believed was spoon-fed to us. We weren't taught to think critically or to ask questions or to think outside the box. You were just kind of expected to believe what they taught you and to trust the people in leadership over you. And so it took me a long time to even get to where I was able to start what we would call deconstructing, or pulling apart what I believed, because it wasn't safe to do that. And it came at a very high cost. And so for me to do that, it really didn't happen until I was in my early 20s, and I ended up falling in love with my female roommate, which was the furthest thing ever from my mind to have happened, because you just didn't do that. And so I kind of call it my epiphany of horror, because it was like the thing that you knew was never supposed to happen. And because I had such a close relationship with God my entire life, and was so steeped in faith, and really, I mean, yes, was taught it by my family, but also had a genuine relationship with God myself. And so to then be put in this place where you suddenly have to figure out something this piece of who you are that does not fit the mold. Those two worlds did not go together. They did not coincide. And it really took a big toll on my mental health, being that I was so isolated, being that there was so much homophobia in my family and in my upbringing, which then creates internalized homophobia inside of you. And you're really taught to hate yourself. And so I dealt with a lot of mental health issues. I had a lot of depression and anxiety, which spiraled down to self-harm and suicidal ideations, and my world just got very, very dark because there was nowhere safe for me to go. And in fact, my parents had found out about my first girlfriend, and when they did, they showed up at my door at 6 a.m, knocking on my door, and interrogated me, and then said, "Amber, don't you ever tell anybody about this, because if you do, it will ruin your reputation forever." And so I swept it under the rug, and we pretended like everything was okay, even though it was very, very much not. And so I had to then, really, because of my mental health being in such a bad place, it was like, I either have to face this and figure out what this means for me, or it's gonna be the thing that kills me. And so I had to pull away from people for a time and do some things that I was taught were not acceptable. Therapy was not acceptable. Asking questions was not acceptable. Looking into different points of view when it came to the scriptures was not acceptable. And I remember being at my wit's end, and sitting down one day to my computer and just typing in like, "gay churches, Colorado." And just seeing what came up, because there was nothing, in Colorado Springs there wasn't that. Certainly not in the evangelical world, there was nothing like that. And so, really the only thing that popped up was a church in Denver, which is where I met Jen Devson. And that was the day that I just reached out to the pastor and like poured my heart out. And I didn't think I would ever get a response, because I grew up in a mega church of 14,000 people where you send something and it just goes into cyberspace, and you never hear back from anybody.
Here sometimes.
So you get it. But not 2 or 3 hours went by, and I got the most heartfelt response from the pastor himself.
Wow.
And he just said, "Please come. I will set you up with somebody to meet you, to show you around, to take you to lunch." And so I did. And that was probably one of the most life-saving measures that I could have possibly done, because I found safety in a faith community that embraced me and showed me what it was like to love God and make space for people of all sexual orientations and gender identities. And to see that, I think, is the day that things really changed for me, or the start of it at least, because it showed me that there was something different possible. And I remember going home and writing in my journal that day and saying, like, I've passed the point of no return. Like, I knew that something had shifted and there was no going back. And so, of course, it was a long process of trying to figure out what the scriptures said, because that was very important to me. It was a process of going through therapy. It was a process of finding community and building that up around me. But eventually it got to the point where I knew I was going to have to come out to my family, because there was just, I mean, we lived within a mile of each other. We saw each other all the time. Living that and trying to put that facade on is exhausting. And so there was no doing that long term. I knew that I was going to have to come out. And of course, that was a brutal decision in itself, because I knew it could take a big toll on my family. And I didn't really know what that would be or what it would look like, but I knew it wasn't going to be good. And so it took a long time of building up to it. And eventually I sat them down and I told them the journey that I had been on. And I told them the journey that I had taken with God, because I knew that was going to be their biggest question, right? And their biggest fear. And in the end, they just looked at me with this like deer in the headlights look and said, I have nothing to say to you right now. And they got up and walked out. And we didn't talk for like 3 weeks after that, which was an eternity in my family. And when we did, I think I had hoped that they would kind of lean into the journey that I had been on and like try and listen to all that it had taken me to get to this point. But instead they compared me to murderers and pedophiles. They said, how dare you do something so selfish to our family? And they took away my keys to the house. And it was one of those like, I love you, but we no longer feel safe letting you have open access to our home. And so everything changed, and it never recovered. We had about a year and a half of very tense, awkward interaction where we were trying to make something that just wasn't working. Where you only talked about the weather because that was the only common thing you had anymore, you know, and it just was very, very difficult. And eventually they just kind of drew a line in the sand and said, we're done. And we haven't spoken in over a decade. So my family still lives in Colorado Springs. I did move to Denver for about a decade, and I am currently back there now. Don't plan to be there long term, but that's where we are right now. But it's been like over a decade since I've had a conversation with my family. And that wasn't just my parents, that was all of my extended family, my sibling, my aunts, my uncles, my cousins. Like, everybody is just so steeped in that belief system that it really just turned instantly. And so my faith community was a big part of what saved me in that season and what got me closer. And it's what sprung me into the advocacy work that I've been doing now for almost a decade. And that has been a huge gift as well, to be able to use my story to then make other queer people feel less isolated, and also to spread hope and awareness and education. And so that's largely what I've been doing for almost a decade now.
Wow. It's hard to talk. Whew. You share a lot in the book about toxic evangelism and how harmful it is. What do you keep learning about the culture that you were so deeply steeped in and abused by?
I think I keep learning how toxic it really was. You know, part of what this new book is I did a lot of research that went into the history of evangelicalism and the eugenics piece that was played into that, and the role that it even plays into focus on the family, which was very surprising to me. And I think the more research I did and the deeper I went, the more I just was so appalled and shocked at some of the things I was taught to believe, the things that we normalized, and the way that it's influencing, I think, Christianity as a whole, the way it's influencing Christian nationalism, the way it's influencing queer people, marginalized people across the board, just how toxic it is. And how much that we've got to change that to create a new narrative that I think is one that we can stand by as people of faith.
Can you unpack the word toxic for a minute? Just the level, tease it out?
Yeah. I mean, some of what I found in a nutshell is when you go back to the roots of the eugenics, and like Paul Popenoe was an atheist eugenicist. And did a lot of harm even for women who were pregnant and trying to have people with mental illness sterilized, and was successful at it. Well, come to find out, James Dobson, who founded Focus on the Family, was a mentee of his and served actually right under him. And so even though a lot of people don't know the name of Paul Popenoe, those thoughts and ideas are embedded into Focus on the Family and the way that it's been founded and raised for so many years. And so those ideas and the harm of trying to create Christian nationalism really at the core. You have things like the moral majority and these things that have come up that try to create this one brand of Christianity that is supposed to come into power, which is even, I mean, goes as deep as things like homeschooling, because they're trying to keep kids out of mainstream education and then teach them what they believe about evolution and women's bodies and queer, like all these, taking Christian beliefs or evangelical beliefs and embedding it, and it's worked. I mean, if you look at it and like as an example of what I went through, and I look back at that and I'm like, how much that actually worked to then keep you distanced from mainstream culture and from all these different other things that are influencing society. And then they raise them up and they want them to vote, and it's, and so taking over the nation with these Christian principles, or what they deem as Christian principles, and what an impact that has had. And I think that's what's been so completely shocking and appalling, is the level of success that they've had at that, and how much that's influenced. I mean, a lot of people that I even grew up with that are still in that world, that have never stepped outside of it, they've never questioned, they've never gone beyond that, and they're still so encased in that belief system, and just how much harm that's doing to us as a society.
Yeah, wow. You talk a lot about your journey of mental and physical wellness, and it's been a long and painful journey.
Yes.
Can you share more about the toll that this particular system have on people, and how focusing on your wellness has transformed your core message about yourself and your faith? And can you just sort of share where you've landed here? Our faith should change every day. It does. Yes. We're dynamic human beings.
Yes.
But here today on October 13th, what does Amber's faith look like?
Yeah. Well, that's a big question, because it overarches so many things.
3 minutes.
I got 3 minutes. All right. 1 minute for each of them, right? Exactly. Well, I mean, in terms of mental health, the toll was great. I mean, when you grow up in a system that really, at its core, is teaching you to hate who you are, you think of things of like the heart is deceitful above all things and desperately wicked, and the way that we embodied those beliefs, to always sacrifice yourself and put yourself last, and the way that that's still impacting the way I do relationships today, the way I'm still having to pull those things apart. But if you think of it in terms of LGBTQ identity, the internalized homophobia, that really isolates you from others, that causes you to hate who you are, which then, I mean, in many situations has led to suicide. Yes. And so it's taking lives quite literally, because of this toxic belief that who you are is inherently bad and unacceptable to God and others. And to the point that you are an abomination and unworthy to even exist. And that's why we're losing so many lives. And the statistics are high. But not only that, when you look at physical health, LGBTQ people are at much higher risk of chronic illness. And I think a lot of that has to do with long-term identity suppression. If I look at my life and how long I had to hide who I was and keep that away from other people, and have to hide who my core being was, even from myself. And then the toll that's taken, and the amount of trauma that I went through with my family. I now live with 2 severe chronic illnesses, for which there's no cure. And so I am a huge advocate for things like self-care and boundaries, and learning those things as early on as possible to try and prevent this long-term damage, because I mean, the body keeps the score, right? And it holds the trauma, and being able to redo that and undo that is such a long process. So I think in terms of my faith, that has definitely evolved so much over time. And I think it continues to. I am not currently part of a faith community, because I still live in Colorado Springs. But I value spirituality. I value, some of my favorite things are to be out in nature, or to walk a labyrinth, or to do these meditative practices that kind of still, they calm your nervous system, right? And they help you get in tune with the divine, and they help you do these different things that are just continually healing. And I love that aspect of that. And so I think continuing to lean into different aspects of faith that are different than the tradition that I grew up with, that continue to teach me so much about just how expansive God is and the amount of diversity that we get to experience as people of faith.
I love this question about bravery. Even I said it, and I say it today, and a lot of people would say, including myself, what you're doing today is so brave. You're so brave. And you talk about bravery can be misconstrued. What does brave mean to you?
Well, I think, a lot of people do say, well, you're so brave for sharing your story, and that's a very common thing that I hear. But the truth is I didn't have a choice. It's a method of survival. You're doing what you have to do to survive. But I think bravery is choosing yourself. Over that idea that we have to sacrifice everything that we are for the sake of other people, or for the sake of God. I think God wants us to love who we are, and so leaning into that and truly embodying that, I think is one of the bravest things that we can do, because it's not only counter to what we are taught a lot of times in faith systems, but it's also countercultural to our society, that also always teaches you have to be thinner or younger or whatever it is to fit the mold. So defying that and just really leaning into loving who you are right now. And I think that that's something that I would say has been a gift of chronic illness, that it's taught me to set boundaries, that it's taught me to lean into that. It's taught me to love who I am in different ways, because my body doesn't function the way that it used to, because I can't do the things that I used to, because it looks different to go out in public now, because all those things that influence the way that I live life, but also learning that I'm worthy of setting those boundaries, that I'm worthy of loving who I am and doing things differently to even be happy. When you're taught that you're not supposed to be happy, you're supposed to sacrifice yourself to even be happy, and to learn that that's a good thing and that God wants that for us. I think when you can embrace that, that's a huge gift to yourself.
It's a reminder of the commandment that Jesus, he summed everything up and said, love God and love one another as you love yourself. So bravery is choosing to love yourself. That's a beautiful image.
Yes.
As we're sort of wrapping up, if you were sitting one-on-one with every single one of us in this room, and you would want to make sure and share something with us, what would you want us to know, and what would you say?
I think one of my biggest messages is love who you are. I think for allies, it's to use your voice and use your privilege and use your resources to help the LGBT community, to help the marginalized in whatever way you can. And for queer people to know that you're worthy of love and belonging. And that you deserve a place in the family of God. You deserve a place in society. You deserve to be loved and to receive love. You are worthy of love and belonging. And who you are at your core is good.
Yeah.
And to lean into that.
Wow, that's beautiful. So how can we follow your work? How can we support you? I know that she has books out there that afterwards, I'll tell you, right after church, you are invited to either stay or you can go get a cup of coffee and come back in. We will do a little Q&A, so if you have more questions for Amber, which I'm sure you do, you're welcome to do that as well. As you can purchase her new book for $20. If you have cash, you have to pay exact cash. She doesn't have change. She has Venmo, and she can take cards as well. But I do hope that do you have your other book as well?
I have a few copies of my other book, yes.
Yeah, so if you want to purchase those. But how else can we support your work, Amber?
Well, you can follow me online. I'm on Facebook and Instagram at Amber Cantorna-Wylde. You can find my website, which is kind of the hub for all the things that I do and all the different ways to connect with my work. And then one of the other things is to join Patreon. If you're someone that's looking to partner with somebody doing grassroots level work, Patreon is a wonderful way that you can come aside financially to help support this and make my work sustainable. And you can join for as little as like $10 a month. But the more that people kind of gather in and everybody does their part, the more that this work is sustainable. And so you may not feel specifically called to go out and do this kind of work on your own, but you can partner with somebody who's doing it and doing it really at the grassroots level, as opposed to big organizations that are also doing great work. But those of us that are kind of on the ground really struggle to continue what we're doing because of the sustainability. Like social justice isn't one that pays the bills very well. And so, as I'm sure you understand in ministry as well. So any way that you can come alongside and support that kind of work is so helpful for getting the message to the next person that really needs it, that is still struggling in isolation because they don't have family that supports them and they haven't found a faith community yet, and they need those resources. And so it's really helping get that to those people that really need it, whether it be through book form or through the Unashamed to Love Collective that I lead, and these different opportunities where they can engage and find that belonging and find that love and learn to love who they are as well.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Yes, thank you.
Thank you so much. I do hope you will come back in right after church and spend some more time learning Amber's story, learning about what it means to be an ally. And I have to say that it is an important core value here at Heart of Longmont that we choose inclusivity, that you are welcome. And so as our ushers come forward this morning, I am reminded that we choose here at Heart of Longmont to be reconciling. We choose here at Heart of Longmont to be inclusive, and we choose to be people of justice in the world, especially using our privilege to speak up for the LGBTQ+ community. So as the ushers come forward today, may you live and give generously, bravely, and courageously each day of your life.